Welcome to The Backstory. I'm your host, Anne Hancock Toomey. Over the course of my career, I've had the privilege to work with and learn from and guide some incredible leaders, mostly in healthcare, but not always. The Backstory is a chance for me to talk to some of them, unpack who they are and where they came from, and how it all influences who they are today and how they lead. Ultimately, each conversation offers a case study in what I'm calling authentic leadership. Let me now invite you into our conversation for the real backstory. Today, I have the great pleasure of spending time with Dr. David Miller, current president and incoming CEO of Michigan Medicine, where he has practiced and served for more than 25 years. Dr. Miller is an accomplished researcher, longtime professor, and a urologic cancer surgeon who still practices medicine, and this is all alongside his role leading an $8 billion academic health system. Most importantly, he's a married father of 3 awesome kids and a lifelong Michigan Wolverine fan. Welcome to the podcast, David.
Thanks, Anne. It's great to be here, and I really feel privileged to have the opportunity for this conversation and look forward to our discussion and sharing some thoughts that I hope will be helpful for our colleagues and your audience.
Well, the privilege is all mine. I mean, while you and I have not had the opportunity to work together, my colleagues absolutely love partnering with you. And they tell me that you are the kind of leader that people want to run through walls with, not for, because you would be the first one through said wall. You have spent an entire career in a super complex organization playing many different roles, and there is tremendous, resounding support for your leadership. So I just know that we can learn a lot from your story. So if you're ready, let's dig in.
Thanks, Anne.
Let's start at the beginning. I know you're a Michigan native and your blood runs Wolverine blue. Tell me about how you grew up and about your family.
I did. I grew up in Midland, Michigan, about 2 hours north of Ann Arbor, and Midland's a great place to grow up. It's actually the world headquarters for Dow, an international material sciences company, and so there was tremendous investment in the community by Dow, a place of great schools, great sports. And when I look back on childhood, riding my bike around the neighborhood in the 80s and having the opportunity to spend time with friends and family, there are a lot of really positive memories. My father was a physician in Midland. My mom was an educator. I have an older brother and a younger sister, and we had great opportunity to play sports, to have a strong sense of community, to have great schools that opened my eyes to a number of opportunities, including early exposure to science. You can imagine in a town built around a major chemical company that there was an emphasis on science, and opened a lot of doors that ultimately led to some of my interest in medicine. But probably strongest among those was my dad's experience. I was fortunate enough on some Saturday mornings to go around in the hospital with him, to have the chance to look up to different doctors in our community, learn a little bit about the field, and that was definitely formative for me. And at the same time, I would say that for my family and with my parents, my mom always set the expectation that go and seek those opportunities in front of you. Don't be afraid of challenges and hold yourself to high standards and expectations. So I was fortunate in a lot of ways, and I had a great childhood in Midland, and it was formative for a lot of what the future held for me.
Fantastic. Yeah, it sounds like an idyllic childhood in many ways and just truly foundational to who you've become. Can you recall something specific that you learned from your parents that shaped how you live or how you lead today?
First, one thing that I always learned from my parents was you'll never regret being kind. And even in challenging times, the ability to be honest, to be authentic, but also to be kind is very important. And colleagues, friends, family members will remember that. And I think that was an important lesson. I think I'll also say the importance of setting high expectations. There was always an expectation in our family that you'd be busy, that you'd be working on something, that you'd be trying to make progress. And that was a shared responsibility that we had. And so I can remember earlier in my childhood when I decided I wanted to stop playing sport A, the response from my parents was, okay, what are you going to do instead? Yes. And so I think that some of those virtues I've carried forward with me, and they've informed how I've tried to work as a team member and how I've tried to lead.
Well, tell me about your first job. What was that very first paycheck that you received? And from that job, maybe what's something you learned from it?
Yeah, my very first job was as a camp counselor at the basketball camp where I went to high school, Midland Dow High School. And it was a place where a lot of the kids growing up in Midland would spend a couple weeks every summer. And it was a job that allowed you to mix interest in basketball with working with other kids. And so that was a lot of fun. But it also taught me right away the importance of, in leadership, that you have to also be able, use the phrase earlier, running through the wall together. I think I learned there that if you're going to coach basketball, you have to be reasonably good at basketball. So the importance of practicing being able to lead by example was definitely one lesson I took away from that opportunity. But beyond that, it was a way to spend a little bit more time in the gym in the summer with some of my friends. So a great first job that I still look back on with significant fondness.
I love it. So now, did you play basketball from a young age, I assume?
I did. I always say I was a below average basketball player, but I worked hard at it. I grew up going to camps, played in middle school and then again in high school. And it was a great introduction to the importance of teamwork, the importance of hard work and persistence. And as I said, through all that hard work, I ended up being what I often refer to as a below average player, but someone who loved it very much.
Okay, tell me, who is a leader that you can remember from your childhood, from those days playing basketball, a teacher or a coach or a parent or an adult? Who's the first leader that you can remember that impacted you in a positive way?
Any discussion of that positive impact, I think, has to start with my parents. I mentioned my mom and dad, who've been so formative, and I think the core values that I try to bring forward. But I will say, in Midland, I mentioned this being the home of Dow, and it turned out that the CEO of Dow at that time actually lived in our neighborhood, and I had the chance to interact with him in some different ways, and it was fairly formative. In fact, part of it was that I would be out in our driveway practicing basketball, and he ended up coming to one of our games. I think we lost the game. I don't think I had a particularly outstanding performance, but he sent me a note afterwards that has stuck with me. And in it, he outlined some principles for success from his vantage point. And as you can imagine, in Midland, the CEO of Dow was someone who was highly visible in the community.
Yes.
And a couple of those points have really stuck with me. He made the reference that, in his view, some of the keys to success are first to always use your talents to the best of your ability, right? Understand what you do well and try to bring that forward in a way that positively impacts others. And the second was to not be afraid of the risks associated with the mantle of leadership. And so at different times in my career, I've asked myself those questions. Is this an opportunity where my skill set may be particularly useful or helpful or well applied? And second, when you face decisions at various points in your career, there is always some risk. And so are you ready to assume those risks with the goal of potentially also achieving the impact of leadership? So that individual was Paul Orphis, who was the CEO of Dow in the 80s when I was growing up. And he was certainly an early leader whose guidance and words have had an impact for me over many years.
What a gift. My goodness. Is he someone that you're still in touch with today?
I had been in interval touch with him. Unfortunately, he passed away recently within the last few months. Okay. But I did actually keep the letter he wrote me from childhood, and I still have it both in the paper copy and on my computer, and I pull it out every now and then during some of those tough decisions and reflect on those words. So definitely an early life influence.
No kidding. Let's fast forward to the decision to attend college at the University of Michigan. What did you study, and did you know you wanted to be a doctor at that time?
Yeah, I think when I started, I had an inclination. I was interested in medicine. As I had mentioned, I had the chance to spend a little bit of time rounding with my dad, and I was always fascinated by the idea of understanding how you could help people and join that with science, if you will. And so I had an inclination, and I entered science, and I did major in biology, so I took some classes to prepare from a pre-med perspective. I connected with that curriculum. I enjoyed the biology. Chemistry was very hard. Calculus was very hard, but the biology side of it I liked very much. And so I did pursue that through college and ultimately for the application process for medical school. And I think some of it certainly reflected my own experience in my family, giving me exposure, which, not everybody has the chance to have that exposure. So I was very fortunate. But I think once I had a sense that some of the foundational scientific aspects of it were areas of continued interest, it really cemented my interest in pursuing the field.
Now, why did you choose urology?
There were a couple key points that were of great interest to me. First, I was drawn a bit to the action-oriented nature of surgical fields, the idea that there are interventions and ways to help almost immediately, if you will, with the challenges that your patients are facing. At the same time, I really appreciated those disciplines where I could see that you had a long-term relationship with the patients, that you would meet them at a time of need, offer your counsel, your help, and then follow over term and really get to know them as people, as individuals, to impact their lives over the long term. And urology was a field that I think offered both of those. Many of the conditions in urology can be treated with surgical interventions, but many also require long-term follow-up. But I've also was very interested in helping take care of patients with cancer. And in urology and in urologic cancer in particular, which is my specialty, I really found this really captivating mix of those three factors: the ability to help patients in the near term, to offer long-term care that meaningfully impacts their lives, and to understand and be doing work in the field of cancer care.
Okay, so you were at Wash U for medical school.
Correct.
Did you know where you wanted to ultimately land and practice? Did you know you wanted to move home?
I knew at the end of undergraduate that I wanted a different experience outside of Michigan. I'd been in Michigan my whole life.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, my family has a long history of Michigan Wolverines, although my dad went to undergrad at Michigan State.
Oh, no.
But we're fans of both schools.
Okay.
But when I was finishing, I knew that the next few years were going to be busy. I knew that residency would be a busy time. And I was really drawn to the idea of being closer to home, back closer to my parents. My wife, Inga's family, is also from Michigan, so there were a lot of reasons to come home. And the program at University of Michigan was one where I felt it struck a great balance on both the quality of the training and the quality of the people in the program. And one of the other major mentors in my career was Jim Monty, who was the chair of the Department of Urology at the time. And his career was one it seemed even at that point that I wanted to emulate. So there were a lot of reasons to come back home. And one of the things I did think about, and just to share, is I would often say to myself, like, what if you had a free Thursday night in the middle of residency? How would you perhaps want to spend that time? And one of the things that seemed really important to me, and that was important and remains important to me, was the flexibility to spend that time with family to the greatest extent possible. And so I knew it would be a busy segment of my career, a busy time for our family. And so being back in Michigan made a lot of sense to both Inga and me.
That makes lots of sense. So you mentioned Jim Monty. Tell me, what do you remember that you learned from him as a leader who shaped you early in your medical career?
Yeah. I'll say in retrospect, I often think a lot about leadership attributes. And one group of them that I shamelessly borrow from an architect in my hometown of Midland, Alden Dow, used to talk about the concepts of honesty, humility, and enthusiasm in the built environment. Talking about buildings, but those were always attributes that resonated with me. And Dr. Monty, who's leading urologic cancer surgeons in the world, was simultaneously an extraordinarily humble while still confident individual. And it was his authenticity, his humility, his willingness to connect with everyone around him, whether it was the first day resident, nurses on the unit, the circulator in the OR. Every member of the team was important and was felt to be valued, and that resonated with me. And the other thing, that a small attribute that resonated with me, was he understood both the big and the small things. The big things, right, to set high expectations and to support your team members in achieving those expectations. But he understood the small things too, like sometimes something as simple as saying, "Great job" or "Thank you." Those don't cost a cent. They're not always sufficient, but they're certainly necessary in the setting of leadership and in encouraging others to move in a direction together. And Dr. Monty did all those things well. He set the highest standards. He supported you in those standards, but he was humble and kind in a way that made you feel like you were part of a team and that you wanted to contribute to something bigger than just the work you were doing.
Very good. Well, let's talk a little more about you and your journey. So you're practicing medicine at Michigan Medicine. You're in your alma mater. How did you make the journey from practicing medicine to administration?
Oftentimes when I've contemplated this, it's probably some combination of serendipity and planning. When I came back to Michigan as a faculty member, I started my career really wanting to be a surgeon scientist, building a practice, taking care of patients, trying to help solve these really challenging issues arising in their lives. And then at the same time, advancing science in that area. So doing research, writing grants and manuscripts, contributing to the literature. And so I had this background, and I was moving my career forward, trying to write grants and papers and really move in that clinician scientist pathway, when some serendipity happened. And that was the partnership of the University of Michigan with a health system in my hometown of Midland. It was then called Mid-Michigan Health, now My Michigan Health. And it was an affiliation between the academic medical center and a community-based health system in my hometown, where my dad was a doc. And I started to look at that and say, how do we make that meaningful? make this partnership something that matters to patients and communities. And so I got involved in our work, what I would call in the strategy and clinical program development. And it opened my eyes to a whole new set of activities in healthcare, a little bit more on the business side, but really thinking about how do you take some of the areas where I'd been working on, like quality improvement or better care delivery, and accomplish them to scale, not just in the academic medical center where you work, but in other systems and other communities. And if some of the serendipity was the exposure to strategy and new partnerships through that initial role, some of the planning was actually to get some experience in operations, because I really wanted to continue to work on larger scale, better quality of care in healthcare. And so through recommendations and support, I moved into a role as the chief clinical officer for the adult hospitals here at the academic medical center. And then in that role, the pandemic hit. There was a lot of disruption. It stretched me as a leader in many ways and gave me more visibility and exposure in the organization, such that when my predecessor in this role decided to step down, there was some encouragement to look at this role. I did that, was fortunate enough to be selected, and have now been in the president role for 4 years. And this has really been the most challenging leadership opportunity of my career, but I'm deeply grateful to have had all these opportunities through our organization, some of which maybe were anticipated, some of them less anticipated, but getting us to the point where we are today here, Anne.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's quite a leap and then a fast track. When did you enter into the operational responsibilities when Michigan Medicine was partnering with the Midland Hospital? What year was that?
Yeah, so I started in that work in the strategic planning and business development in about 2016.
Okay. So really, it's been the last 9 years or so, right, that you've made that shift from practicing medicine full-time to practicing medicine and jumping into some of these other roles.
Yeah, it's been a busy and eventful 8 or 9 years, moving from strategy and into operations and into the current role. I've certainly learned a lot along the way. And during that time, there have been times where I felt like I had a clarity on the direction and on the work. And there have been times where I've definitely felt fully in learning and in uncertainty mode. And that's been a stretch for me as an individual and as a leader. But through it, I think I've learned a lot about our organization. I've learned a lot about healthcare delivery. More broadly, I've learned a lot about myself, and I've been fortunate to have great teammates, team members, and communities to connect with along the way.
Now, I know you still practice medicine. Why is it important to you to maintain your clinical practice with all these other responsibilities that you have?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I was in clinic yesterday, and a lot of my patients know now that I'm going to be transitioning into this other role in July. And almost all the patients I met yesterday said, "Are you still going to be practicing when July comes?" And my answer was yes, that is my plan. And I love taking care of patients, positively impact the lives of others. And we all have the chance to do that in many different ways, and all the different work we do, whether it's work as a healthcare administrator or work as a physician or work in communications or work in revenue cycle, across our whole team. But that patient care has really been foundational for me, and I love doing it. The time when I'm in clinic and when I'm in the OR are highly rewarding, high impact times for me. Now, I'm also realistic, though. Like, if you're going to be a surgeon, you have to be doing enough surgery to make sure that you're doing it well, and I monitor that carefully. I've limited the scope of the surgeries that I do, but I love taking care of the patients first and foremost. Second, it keeps me closely connected with the work we do every day. I have the opportunity to see the challenges that our frontline team members are seeing, whether that's related to the complexities with our scheduling systems or the electronic medical record. And I think there's a certain leadership credibility that comes with that. Now, you can't do that across the board in every circumstance, but there's a certain authenticity of understanding those issues. I also think it creates visibility that allows you to get feedback to make the organization better. I always say when I'm down in the operating room on a given Monday, I seem to be quite popular with my peers to get, as an opportunity to receive feedback about what's working well and what we can do better. And I think it keeps you connected to the work that we're trying to do every day. I certainly recognize I can't do it at the same scale that I used to, and it has to be in a way that's meaningful. But I'd like to try to preserve that because fundamentally it's such a source of joy for me, and it really represents the fundamental work of our clinical enterprise right now.
What a model you are for other physician executives. I know it is hard to balance, but it is so important for all the reasons that you just articulated. So, David, you are taking on a very big role in July, CEO of Michigan Medicine, which of course includes the health system and the medical school. How do you think about managing the competing priorities that inevitably, you're dealing with every day in an organization this large and complex?
First, I'll be honest. One of the issues with the role I've been in currently is that I often say this when I interact with department chairs or I interact with the leadership of the medical school, my responsibility has been to focus on the clinical enterprise. But the clinical enterprise is only one part of a much broader, fully integrated academic health system. And so that kind of calibration and full vantage point is going to be incredibly important to continue to focus on all aspects of our mission. So how to do that? I think one is leadership curiosity. For me, I look forward to spending more time learning more about the detail of the innovative research happening in our medical school departments, of the work happening in our centers, to really understand that work and ask the question at how a leadership level we can create an environment where the sum is greater than the individual parts. And I think there are a couple ways that we're going to have to do that. One is recognize our connection to a world-leading university. President Santa Ono has outlined a Vision 2034 for the university, where one of the pillars of that is human health and well-being. And to do that, we're going to have to connect the strengths of our clinical delivery system. And so that's going to require some intentionality. Yeah. I think that we're going to want to work together to identify some areas of programmatic focus. They might be in particular disciplines like cancer, or they might be in the ability of tech-enabled care, right? And then finally, I think we have to ask ourselves, how do we impact as many lives as we can? And so we have the academic medical center, but we also now have a statewide network of care where we have the opportunity not only to improve care delivery, but also to advance scholarship and research and education in a much broader and more diverse set of communities across the state of Michigan in a way that improves lives. So it's an incredibly exciting time, but it's one that's going to require curiosity in my role as a leader and on the part of our organization, intentionality in finding areas of prioritization. And so I think despite some of the turbulence that exists in healthcare right now, I think we have every reason to feel like the future is bright.
Now, I've drank the Kool-Aid. I'd like to come work for you. That sounds fantastic.
We'd welcome having you come to Ann Arbor. And I know that you're a big basketball fan, but also on any Saturday in the fall in the Big House, more than 100,000 fans is quite a sight. So I'll look forward to welcoming you to a game at some point in the future, Ann.
Okay, I'll be there. Okay, well, I'm going to ask you a little bit of a tricky question, but I think you are so well equipped to answer it because you represent both vantage points. And I think David, our firm does a lot of consumer survey in healthcare, right? Particularly measuring trust in healthcare. And our latest consumer research shows that a major decline in trust in health systems and in other healthcare institutions. Trust in doctors and trust in nurses is sky high, unmoved since the pandemic. How do you lean into the latter to address the former as you think about your new role?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And we've talked a lot in healthcare delivery about well-being of team members and trust of patients and the experience of patients. In the last 5 years, I was reading an article from the New York Times this morning reflecting back on 5 years since the start of the pandemic and what it has meant for our country, what it's meant for the world, what it's meant for healthcare delivery. But that trust is really at the heart of healthcare, and it's been impacted in many ways. I mean, after all, when you walk out in the waiting room in a clinic where you're taking care of patients with cancer, what you're hoping is that you can get them to a point where they're focused on anything other but the reason they're there. And so how do you do that to scale in a health system through the incredible care that individuals provide, even while institutions are being increasingly questioned? And I think it comes back to what are the cultural virtues of the organization? Does it have honesty? Do we recognize and talk about, for instance, when we have access challenges? Are we willing to say we'd like the front door to our organization to be open and more inviting and easier to access for everyone? And right now it's not where it needs to be, but we're measuring our performance. We know what the areas of work are, and here are some of the steps we're taking, and we welcome your feedback along the way. The second is humility, right? The idea that it is our privilege to be able to take care of patients. How do we present that in a way that resonates and seems real and authentic? And I think, again, that boils down to a lot of cultural issues. What will we do as members of our organization when no one else is looking? Will we turn and help a patient with wayfinding? Will we answer their questions? Will we stop in a room where a patient is asking for help? And then I think we also have to have the humility to recognize when we haven't gotten it right, when there are issues where we've seen opportunities to improve safety, to be honest and upfront about that and to work on it. And I think healthcare systems have to focus in all of those areas, that the honesty about where the challenges are, the curiosity of how to get better, the culture of support, and then the kind of, what I'll say, the humility to consistently get better and do all that in this incredibly difficult environment. And then finally, in our role in the broader community, right? How are we making sure that the connectivity to community is real and meaningful? That's a complex equation. I always say that I'll know we're making progress in areas in the organization where we need improvement, and I'll use access as an example. I'll know we're making progress when both our measured performance and the stories in the organization align. What do I mean by that? When a patient calls and the call is answered in 15 seconds and their issue is addressed, that's the measured performance. When I hear from patients in the community that it's gotten a lot easier to get an appointment at Michigan and I was able to do it in area A, B, or C, those are the stories. More and more when we hear those aligning, we'll know where we're going. And so organizing around those goals on behalf of our patients is what I think we have to do to address the trust issues, even with the core virtues of honesty and humility.
Wow. I could not agree more with what you just said. I think we find that people don't trust institutions, right? They don't trust buildings. People trust people. And that's why I think we see such sky-high trust and credibility that patients and consumers place on nurses and on doctors, because they're thinking of their nurses and their doctors. And they also place it in leaders. Like you will have the opportunity to set the tone. You already do at Michigan Medicine, and creating a leadership trickle-down effect that is really devoted to the things you just described: humility and responsible transparency and over-communicating and owning up when we've made mistakes as an organization and talking about how we're going to do better and what we're committed to.
Yeah, well, and it would be hard to summarize that better than the way you just did. I think those are a lot of the key virtues that you strive for. And in a big, complex organization, sometimes when that isn't perfect, you have to own up, redouble, and keep working at it. That's the kind of day-to-day, like hearkening back to the beginning. What did you learn from my parents? I would say in that scenario, that'd be something my mom said: get up tomorrow and you'll try to do it better the next day.
Okay, David, before we talk more about leadership, I want to talk about your family. We talked about your parents, of course, and your brother and sister, but I know you've been married a long time and you have 3 kids you're very proud of. Tell me about them.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk about the best part of my life, the best part of every day. So my wife, Inga, we've been married for more than 25 years. She is the most unselfish, kind, and committed spouse, mom, wife, daughter-in-law, daughter. And I always say she's an order of magnitude more unselfish than me. She's an accountant by training, worked in public accounting and at the Michigan Business School for many years. And now I kind of say she's the chief operating officer of a tennis academy here in Ann Arbor. And I say that in a way, it took me a little while to understand what a chief operating officer does. Now that I've been in this role for long enough, I feel like I can attribute that. But Inga's a great leader in her own right. We have 3 wonderful kids: Kari, our oldest daughter, who graduated from Michigan last year; Reese, who's our middle child. Reese is a sophomore at University of Michigan; and Grant is our 14-year-old son who goes to Tappan Medical School. They are the absolute joy of our lives. Tennis is a huge part of our life, as I mentioned, and our kids have grown up playing tennis. Both of our daughters played at Michigan. Our oldest daughter, Kari, actually was playing a match this morning over in Portugal, and she's trying a year on the tour, and we'll see how she does, but has had the opportunity to travel and learn more about herself. Reese is a student at the business school at Michigan, and Grant is fully engaged as an 8th grader at Tappan. But tennis is a big part of our life, but they are an incredible source of joy and inspiration for me and Inga every day. We love sports. We love Michigan athletics. We love simple bonfires in our backyard. And probably the most popular member of our family is our dog, Wilson, whose name is after the tennis ball, as you might imagine. So in this busy job, being centered around family is something that I've worked very hard to do, and sometimes imperfectly. And I'll come back to Dr. Monty. At the end of his career, he wrote this great article, talked about leadership, and it talked about this idea of, can you fully separate your personal and professional life? It turns out that those are both intermixed a little bit in even how your family views you. And so I often say with Inga, like, if you judge how you're doing on any given week in that balance, maybe imperfect, but you have to get it right over several weeks and several months in that constant calibration. But my family, for whom I have so much pride and love is the centerpiece of everything we do. And all I can say, though, is that if my kids ever heard me on a podcast like this, I'm not sure how popular I'd be, but they are wonderful. And thank you for asking. And thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit of their story, Anne.
Of course. They're making fun of you right now.
Exactly. That would be the theme of the conversation.
Very good. Well, thanks for sharing that. Well, as you know, David, this is a podcast about leadership, and you have had the opportunity to work with many, many leaders over the course of your career. I know this is a tough question, but if you had to boil it down to 3 characteristics of the most effective leaders, what would those be?
Yeah, thanks. And I'll come back to what I mentioned. I really believe, I always say I shamelessly borrow these attributes from Alden Dow of honesty, humility, and enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Let's say honesty is a given, right? I mean, I think if you're not honest, it will declare itself. And that expectation of a leader, I think, is just
Table
is a given.
stakes. Yeah.
Right. So let's then talk about the other 2, and then I'll share a third that I think is valuable. First is the humility, right? In leadership roles, what I've found is that you will face challenging decisions where there's no perfect answer. I often say we're looking for the least imperfect solution. And when that happens, you'll make the right decision sometimes and you'll make the wrong decision sometimes. But if you approach it with humility, when you make the wrong decisions, people will stay with you. If you make the wrong decision every time, maybe not forever, but if you make the wrong decision and you approach it with humility, people will stay with you. And decisions that rise to different levels of leadership, they do that because they're hard, right? And there's not a simple answer. And I think humility keeps you grounded. It keeps your team with you. And it allows you to adjust when you see something that isn't going in the direction you wanted it to. And I think that's an incredibly important attribute for a leader. Enthusiasm is important because what we do is hard. And it's not enthusiasm that, look, we have it all figured out. This is all going to be easy. It's a realistic optimism for the future that through the work you're doing together, you can improve the challenges of your organization, but most importantly, improve and advance the lives of the patients you serve, of the team members on your team, and of the community. I think if your core value is enthusiasm or an optimism about making others' lives better, you can be an effective leader at any level. A third attribute is curiosity. And I think you have to be interested in what others are doing and in their perspectives. And that curiosity plays itself out in an important leadership attribute of visibility, being present in the organization so that your team members know you a little bit as a person. You can't be out there and know everybody. And there's always a certain guardedness that you have to have in a leadership role. But that visibility is important. It creates a sense of connectedness and a sense of accountability and trust that's important. So I would say humility, enthusiasm, curiosity, 3 important traits. From those, you can build a set of leadership skills and a set of leadership experiences that allow you to move forward in the day-to-day tasks of leadership.
Yeah, I agree. Those are 3 things that you really can't teach, right? You can observe and you can hone in yourself, you can focus on, but many other skills and expertise can be acquired. Those 3 that you named are kind of innate.
Yeah, they are. And so I think those 3 attributes allow you to perhaps really problem solve as a leader because you're seeking the information and you're receiving the information in a way that can make your organization better.
Yeah, I agree with that. So all great leaders are willing to be vulnerable and admit mistakes and that they're working on particular things. Is there a particular thing that you're working on right now? Part of your leadership, part of your role?
Yeah, I think you mentioned at the beginning, you referenced your extraordinary team members at Girard, Anne, and they said this is someone who people would run through a wall with rather than for. And I interpret that a little bit that I'm engaged in a lot of the work we do. But you have to find a balance as a leadership, particularly at different levels, between being too engaged where your team members aren't having the experiences, the expertise, the challenges, the successes that they need. You know, this is people say, well, are you a micromanager? But there's a difference between being engaged and micromanaging, and striking that balance is something I'm constantly testing myself on. And I think the second is consistency and presence. And we all have challenging days, right? And we all sometimes feel there's so much going on. How am I going to bring your best self forward? Well, as you continue in leadership roles, that becomes more and more an important part of the process. And it's not to show that you're not vulnerable, but there's a consistency through the challenges that's important in leadership. And we've had myriad challenges in healthcare. Learning how to approach those challenges with a clear and consistent and problem-solving mentality is something that I've been working on and continuing to try to get better.
Yeah, appreciate you sharing that very much. Okay, David, you have been very generous with your time, and we're nearing the end of our time together. We always close out these conversations with my very favorite part, which is lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a series of questions and either ors, and you're just going to give me your gut. You ready?
I'm ready. Thank you.
Okay. All right, here we go. Are you an early bird or a night owl?
Definitely an early bird.
How do you start your day?
Wake up early, go on the treadmill, and try to get into work for a little bit of thinking time before the day starts.
All right. If you had to give a TED Talk on one topic right now without any time to prepare, what would it be?
Great question. I would talk about principles for making transitions in leadership. When should you do it? How should you gauge it? And how might you determine whether or not you'd be successful?
Fantastic. Okay, what is the way that you unwind from work?
Time at home with Wilson and a bonfire in the backyard and hearing about the day for Kari, Reese, Grant, and Inga.
Love it. Favorite thing to do on a Saturday?
Early morning cup of coffee at my favorite coffee shop in Ann Arbor. It's the only way to start a Saturday.
Okay, most electrifying tennis player, since you're such a tennis guy.
Oh, I forever have to go back probably to John McEnroe. He was the kind of tennis player as I was growing up. But certainly in the current day, it's hard to imagine tennis without the Williams sisters and then Nadal, Federer, and Djokovic on the ATP Tour. It's been a great era for tennis.
Book you're reading now.
Courage is Calling. It's a compilation of short essays around issues in courage that's been quite informative. What does it mean to be courageous? How do you develop skill sets and expertise in bringing forward courageous concepts? So a number of small stories that I've tried to learn a lot from over the last couple of weeks.
Okay, and what's the best book that you've read on leadership?
Yeah, great question. I would say a book called Irrational Persistence, which really reflected on how leaders work and problem solve through the most challenging times.
What is a piece of advice that you would give your younger self?
Give yourself some grace from time to time. It's not possible to solve every issue in the moment every time.
It's a good one. All right, well, I will end with the question that all good reporters ask, which is there anything more you'd like to share?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. First, thank you so much for the opportunity to share some reflections. And I would say this, I've expressed gratitude to my family, but I also want to express incredible gratitude to our team members here at University of Michigan, at Michigan Medicine and University of Michigan Health for their courage and commitment every day to the patients and communities we serve. It's a source of incredible strength and great admiration. So thank you for allowing me to reflect on that at the close of the interview.
Of course. They are very lucky to have you. I am very inspired by your enthusiasm and your humility and your curiosity and certainly your honesty. It's a pleasure to get to know you, and I'm grateful for the time I've gotten to spend with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Me too.